So our resident cross-country racer Joe has been testing a couple of interesting race bikes for What Mountain Bike recently. He's had the BMC Teamelite 1 XX1 and the Trek Procaliber 9.9 SL. They're both pretty spendy bikes. And the reason why they're interesting is, well, they're both Softails. Are they?
Well, no, not quite. The BMC, they market it as a Softail. The Trek, they are very keen to stress that it is not a Softail. You're not allowed to use words like flex,
Softail.
tail, any others?
Travel.
And travel. So the Trek is most definitely a hardtail, but it has some compliance built into the seat tube, whereas the BMC, as we've said, they definitely market that as a Softail.
The vague idea between both these bikes is that they're a slightly more comfortable, compliant hardtail, which should, in theory, reduce fatigue, which then means you're going to go a little bit faster over the course of a race. So BMC have gone down the sort of semi-traditional Softail route, whereby you're effectively between the rear axle and the top tube you have this elastomer, which takes away some of the buzz from the trail. With the Trek, what you've got is this ISO-speed decoupler, which is borrowed from the Domane, for example, over on the road side of things, which isolates the seat tube when you're sat from some of the buzz from the rear wheel. So the rear, the frame is still sort of vibrating over this, over the trail, but when you're sat in the seat, your bum is insulated from it a little bit.
So to be clear, that means with the BMC, it's working whether you're standing out of the saddle or sitting in the saddle. But with the Trek, compliance will only come into effect when you're sitting on that seat.
If we're going to look at the BMC sort of first off, we're used to seeing elastomers either on very, very cheap suspension forks or from sort of more pricey suspension forks and full sesses back in the day, or even like the Gervin Flex Stem. Elastomers are something which very much went out of fashion. They degraded over time. When they got cold, they didn't work particularly well. But we've seen a resurgence again, so why have they gone this route as opposed to, say, like a little air shock like we're seeing on the new Pinarello road bikes, for example?
BMC have told us that this idea first came from their pro riders. They wanted a Softail with a bit more compliance. I think this is a lot down to World Cup cross-country racing these days, where the tracks are getting gnarlier and gnarlier, the races are getting shorter, big descents, big rocks. A lot of the riders are going to be on full suspension bikes. But for those die-hard hardtail fans, which up until recently Julian Absalom was one, they still like the extra bit of lightweight you get from the hardtail, but just a little bit more compliance, which you get from that 15mm pivot-free flex in the Softail.
So if you've got this little bit of elastomer, which is flexing in and out, up and down, is there not some sort of lateral flex in there? Have BMC tried to tackle that in any way? Otherwise, are we not going to be losing some power through flex?
BMC have actually got two metal rods which sit either side of the seat tube. That's what the elastomer covers. It's bolted on, so the idea is that stops any lateral flex. All you're getting is the vertical movement from the pivot. It comes with three different types, densities of elastomer. You've got soft, medium, and hard. Depending on the weight of the rider, obviously, the heavier a rider, the chances are the harder the elastomer you're going to use. Interestingly, nearly all the pro riders, again, we're talking mid 60 kilos guys that use the softest elastomer, but for a bigger rider, you're going to want the harder elastomer because it's just giving you a bit more support for that extra weight.
So moving on to the Trek then, it borrows this ISO-speed decoupler from their road bikes like the Domane. And basically what this is an elastomer-based or rubber-based sort of widget around the top of the seat tube, top tube junction. So while the two triangles themselves are rigid, the seat tube does have a little bit of fore and aft movement, which means when you're sat down, any bumps which come through are you're insulated a little bit from them. Obviously this means when you're pedaling up, say, a rougher climb, perhaps you're perhaps not getting quite so fatigued.
One thing to say about the Trek is the feeling you get from riding it is a lot stiffer than the BMC because the only movement you're getting is in the post. So as soon as you stand out the saddle, it just feels exactly like a normal razor sharp rock hard hardtail really. It's difficult to say which one's faster. It's kind of just like a different flavour of compliance really, whether you want one that's going to be giving you comfort and compliance all the time or whether you feel like you just want it seated. That's the difference really. It's not that one's better or worse, just a kind of a different way of doing it.
Are the differences in traction coming from the two bikes, or what's the biggest difference then between them?
With the Trek, there's no kind of increase in traction from their old usual hardtail, which didn't have the faster speed decoupler. Whereas with the BMC, because it's working all the time, it feels like you're getting a bit of increased traction. Obviously, this does mean, because it's working all the time, there's kind of a loss in energy and power and efficiency from heat lost through the elastomer, but you hope that you're going to gain power through the fact that the tyre is on the ground more, because that soft tail is doing its thing and allowing you to keep the tyre on the climb more, and that's kind of where hopefully that bike's getting closer to the performance of a well set up full suspension bike.
Obviously spec levels are a little bit different, but in terms of the handling and how the bike rides, what's the difference between them?
The BMC is a more fun bike. The bars are a bit wider, the stem's a bit shorter. The geometry between the two is actually very similar, but when you ride the BMC, it definitely feels like it's more stable on those kind of rocky descents. It does suffer then for kind of tight switchback climbs and stuff like that. It's not quite as nippy as the Trek. The Trek definitely feels like it's more nippy in the corners, but you lose a bit of that stability in the descents. One's not better than the other, but say if you want a bike that you can kind of play around on, have a bit more fun on, I find myself popping the front wheel around and being able to kind of get a bit more loose and gnarly with the BMC. That's the bike for you. Whereas if you want a bike that you're right over the front in that super aggressive XC position, and all you're doing is going out and nailing yourself, that's kind of where you're looking at with the Trek. We've gathered they're both really fast bikes. You're not going to be slow on any of these, and you're not going to blame the bike for losing a race or anything like that. I think the subtlety between the two lies within the finishing kit and how they're spec'd.
If it was my own bike and I was going to be speccing, say, from a frame up, I wouldn't go for the RS1. It's expensive. You're talking about £1,400. You also need specific front wheels with a predictive steering front hub, and again, the wheels are quite expensive. But for me, it's a high-end fork which has a slight weight penalty over, say, the RockShox SID, which is a couple of 100 grams lighter. It's more expensive, and to be honest, the damping from the fork, we find a little inconsistent and perhaps a little harsh. It's an interesting project they've done with the RS1, but performance-wise, we didn't particularly rate it, to be honest.
Another thing I noticed with the Trek is it's got their new standard, which is the boost spacing.
It's an industry-wide standard, but it's sort of pretty much new for 2016 bikes, and you're looking at 148mm rear hub and a 110mm at the front. The RS1 came with a 110 through their predictive steering. I guess what it means for a cross-country racer, especially a privateer, is if you've already got an older set of wheels, they're probably not going to be compatible.
Yeah, Tom makes a really good point. If you're racing hard, you do a hard season, in order to keep that bike running and on the trail throughout the whole season, you're going to have to buy spare wheels, spare parts for your fork as well. The advantage the BMC has is that chances are your old wheels are going to work with it if you're on a race, and again, if you're on a stage race, the chances are the stage race mechanic might have seals for your forks and stuff like that. So that established speccing is probably better for the privateer racer. So I guess in summary, if I was spending my own money on the bike, I'd go with the BMC. That's not to say the Trek's a bad bike,
no,
is it?
I don't think so. I mean, if you're looking for a more traditional cross-country race, if you've been doing it for years and you know exactly what you like and what works for you well, some of the best riders in the world are going to be racing it. There's nothing wrong with the components on it at all. It's just that slight sort of difference in attitude towards the handling of the bike and maybe some of the kit that's being used on it.
Yeah. And it's also worth mentioning that the Trek is a seriously light bike. Without pedals, it's around 20 pounds, so it's a good 500-600 grams lighter than the BMC, which is, it's a fair old chunk of weight.
If you want to see full reviews of both the Trek and the BMC from Joe, check out the video description for links to What Mountain Bike.